are muffled by the hush of early morning. Drivers along Route 86 slowed, rolling down windows to catch a whiff of a storm that wasn't there. Instead, the still air smelled only of dust and creosote, of a dawn too dry to hold rain. Then the sound grew, guttural, pounding, alive. Ranger Elena Cruz stood beside her dusty patrol truck, coffee halfway to her lips, eyes narrowing toward the hills. She'd pulled over to check on a downed fence just past mile marker 42. It was routine. Boring even. But what she saw now shredded the calm like glass. From the ridge came a blur of motion, Maney's wild eyes burning with fear or fury she couldn't yet tell. Dozens of Mustangs, maybe more, were galloping full tilt down the slope, hooves tearing into gravel and sagebrush as they charged straight toward the asphalt. "Jesus," she whispered, nearly dropping her thermos. Behind her, traffic screeched to a halt. A tractor-trailer jackknifed sideways, horns screaming like a dying animal. Horns, shouts, slamming doors, it all rose into a cacophony as the herd hit the pavement, a storm of muscle and instinct. Elena ran. She barely avoided being trampled, flattening herself against the grill of her truck as the Mustangs thundered past. Bay, Palomino, dun, black, each more powerful than the last. One stallion, massive, coal-dark, scar across his cheek like a lightning bolt, locked eyes with her for a fraction of a second. Something flickered there. Recognition? Warning? And then they were past her, swarming the two-lane highway, scattering a dozen stalled cars, not to escape but to, what? She blinked. They weren't running blindly. They were gathering. The lead mare, silver-gray with a white blaze, snorted and reared, then turned in a tight circle near the shoulder of the road. The others followed, fanning out around a thick tangle of roadside brush. Elena's radio crackled. "Cruz, you seeing this? They almost ran me off the road," came Deputy Kyle Mercer's voice, tense and breathless. "What the hell is happening?" "They're not running," she said, watching with disbelief. "They're searching." "What?" "I think they're looking for something." Even as she said it, her brain rejected it. Horses didn't behave this way. Not wild ones. Not in this kind of chaos. But instincts whispered otherwise. Instincts honed from years in the wild, years watching animals communicate in ways humans could never fully understand. She approached slowly, one hand raised. The stallion, the black one, stepped between her and the rest of the herd. He didn't rear. He didn't bolt. He just watched. Her breath caught. That scar. That stance. It couldn't be. "Midnight," she murmured. "You're supposed to be dead." 2 winters ago, she'd found his tracks leading across a frozen canyon. Followed him for miles after a blizzard, hoping to catch the injured stallion before the cold did. But the tracks had vanished at the edge of a ravine. No sign of a body, no fresh trail. She'd assumed he'd fallen. Yet here he was. Taller, older, tougher. And very much alive. The herd parted slightly as she crept closer to the brush where they'd gathered. The thick sage was matted, trampled. Something had lain there. Recently. A soft sound stopped her. It wasn't a whinny. It wasn't wind. It was a cry. Elena dropped to her knees and crawled through the scrub, hands slicing through thorn and dust. There, half hidden beneath a collapsed blanket and scattered leaves, was a body. A girl. Barely a teenager. Dirt caked her skin, lips cracked, cheeks raw from windburn. Her eyes fluttered open, then closed. She whimpered once. Hey, stay with me," Elena said urgently, heart jackhammering in her chest. She pressed 2 fingers to the girl's neck. Faint pulse. Cold skin. Alive but barely. "Elena, what's going on?" Kyle's voice again. "Closer now. I need medics. We've got a child. Maybe 13, 14. She's been out here for days." She didn't ask how she knew. She felt it, the brittleness in the girl's skin, the tremble of exhaustion that went bone deep. The way she curled not toward the ranger, but toward the sound of hooves, as if the horses were safer than any human ever could be. The black stallion stood watch at the edge of the brush, his ears forward, breathing steady. She was with them, Elena whispered. Kyle arrived moments later, skidding to a halt beside her. "Holy," he crouched beside the girl. "How did she survive out here?" "She didn't," Elena said softly. They kept her alive. Paramedics soon arrived. The girl was airlifted to St. Mary's in Carson City. Her condition was critical but stable. She hadn't spoken a word. The Mustangs lingered. For 3 hours they paced the edge of the highway, hooves scraping asphalt, breath rising in clouds despite the morning sun. And then, as if on cue, they turned in unison and retreated into the hills, midnight at the lead. Elena didn't follow. Not yet. Her mind was spinning too fast. That girl. The horses. Midnight. A dead stallion walking. A herd behaving with eerie precision. The way the girl had clutched that tattered horse blanket like it was her last anchor. She waited until the last of the emergency vehicles were gone before walking to where the girl had been found. Something glinted in the dirt. She picked it up. A bracelet, woven from braided strands of black and silver horsehair. Child-sized. It was handmade but skillfully so. She closed her fist around it. The sky was now bright with mid-morning heat, the desert beginning to shimmer. Yet Elena felt a coldness coiling inside her, a deep, quiet dread that this wasn't over. Not even close. She didn't know the girl's name, or why the herd had brought her here, or how Midnight had survived. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. That herd didn't storm the highway by accident. They came for her, and whatever drove them to it was still out there. She turned toward the hills, and followed. The hospital room buzzed with the low hum of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. A nurse adjusted the four-line while Elena sat motionless in the corner, her ranger's jacket draped over the back of a chair, boots streaked with dried desert mud. Across from her, the girl lay cocooned in white sheets, her face pallid, lashes dark against bruised skin. She still hadn't spoken. 3 days had passed since the Mustangs stormed the highway and the girl was found beneath the sagebrush. 3 days of questions with no answers. No ID. No missing persons report that matched her. No name. Just scars, some new, some not, and a silence that gnawed at Elena more than any scream ever could. The sheriff's office had sent a social worker. She tried gently, then firmly to coax words from the girl. Nothing. Not even a nod. But the girl had opened her eyes whenever Elena entered. Just her. And only her. Elena leaned forward now, studying the child's hands. Small, raw-knuckled, bruised. Calluses on her fingers. Not from video games or ballet. These were riding hands. Roping hands. She turned the bracelet over in her palm again, black and silver horsehair tightly braided, the ends scorched as if sealed by fire. Too carefully made for a child. But too small for an adult. You made this, didn't you? Elena said quietly. Or someone made it for you. The girl's eyes fluttered. Elena swore she saw a flicker of pain, or memory, but it vanished just as quickly. Outside the window, clouds darkened over the Sierra crest. A storm building, soft and slow. Elena sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. It felt wrong sitting still. She'd spent her life in motion, tracking, fixing, chasing things that didn't want to be found. But now the thing she needed most to understand was right in front of her, and it refused to move, to speak, to give her anything at all. Until the drawing came. On the morning of the 4th day, a nurse found a torn piece of paper on the floor beside the girl's bed. Charcoal lines, soft and smudged, likely swiped from a hospital art kit. The sketch showed a Mustang foal standing in front of a small, tattered cabin. And beside the foal, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, his hand resting gently on the animal's withers. His face was indistinct. But something about his posture, the way he leaned, there was care in it. Trust. Elena stared at the sketch for a long time. Then she walked out without a word. She knew that cabin. It sat abandoned at the edge of the wilderness preserve, half-burned, long forgotten, 20 miles from where they'd found the girl. She'd been there once before. Years ago. And she remembered the man who lived there. Or tried to. Thomas Whitlock. The horse whisperer. The name came like a sting, old guilt waking in her blood. She remembered the reports. Wild Mustangs tamed without marks. People whispering that Whitlock had a gift. The government had called him a nuisance. Unlicensed, untamed, and, allegedly, a thief. Elena had been the one who tracked him. She'd confronted him at that cabin with a court order and handcuffs she never got to use. He refused to come quietly. They argued. A lamp fell. Flames rose. And by the time she dragged herself from the burning wreck, he was gone. Vanished into smoke. They never found a body. Elena had carried that weight ever since. Guilt that she might have been the cause of a death no one could prove. And now here was a girl, his daughter, drawing pictures of a cabin long destroyed, and a foal that had no reason to exist unless the legends were true. Back at the ranger station she pulled the file, what little remained. A few photographs. One of a younger Whitlock with a foal the color of clouded cream and a black stripe down its spine. A pale gray mare stood beside them, eyes sharp, ears tilted back with suspicion. The mare. Elena pulled up the highway footage from a dashcam. There she was. That same silver-gray blaze, same posture. That mare had been leading the herd. It wasn't coincidence. It was memory. The Mustangs hadn't just stumbled onto the girl. They knew exactly who she was. She drove out to the cabin before dawn the next morning. The foundation was still scorched, half swallowed by sand and time. Tumbleweeds lay in skeletal clumps against the remains of a corral. But inside the blackened walls she found them, small things that had endured. A broken comb still tangled with strands of blonde hair. An old tin lunchbox rusted shut. And carved into the back of the barn door, nearly invisible beneath layers of soot, the initials A.W. Tiny, deliberate. Annie Whitlock. She exhaled shakily. A name. A thread. Back in town, she returned to the hospital with the comb in hand. When she entered the room, Annie looked up, eyes flickering to the object, then to Elena's face. I went to the cabin, Elena said softly. It's still there. Kind of. Annie's lips parted, just slightly. Her fingers twitched on the blanket. Then, slowly she reached out. Elena handed her the comb. Annie took it, held it to her chest like a relic. That night, Annie spoke for the first time. Not to Elena. Not to anyone in the room. But in her sleep. They heard her through the door. Whispered words, fragile as moth wings. Papa said they'd come. Elena stayed until morning. Kyle stopped by the next afternoon. He looked pale, unusually quiet. You're not gonna believe this, he said, handing her a manila envelope. We ran a DNA check. You were right. Her father was Thomas Whitlock. He paused. There's more. A Forest Service hiker spotted a Mustang stallion dragging what looked like a canvas tarp through a dry creek bed. Said it was surreal. Like it knew where it was going. Elena's throat tightened. When? Same day we found the girl. They sat in silence for a long time. She didn't just survive out there, Kyle said finally. They kept her alive. They protected her. Elena nodded. They did more than that. They chose her. But why bring her to the highway? Why risk everything to get her found? Elena thought of the drawing. The man. The foal. The whispered promise. Because he told them to. Because Thomas Whitlock may have vanished into fire, but his legacy hadn't. Not entirely. She looked out the window. The storm clouds had passed. The sky was clear now, crystalline and sharp. The girl was safe. But something deeper stirred beneath the surface. An undercurrent of fear. Or maybe warning. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The wind shifted just before dawn, brushing across the open desert like a sigh. At the edge of the sagebrush sea, Elena Cruz crouched beside a gnarled juniper, binoculars pressed to her face, breath shallow with anticipation. Through the glass, shapes began to materialize in the early light, hooves first, then flaring nostrils, swaying manes, and finally eyes. Dozens of them, wild and wary. The Mustangs had returned. She hadn't seen them in nearly a week. After Annie was hospitalized, they vanished again into the wilderness, silent and unreachable, just as they had always been. But this morning was different. They weren't just grazing. They were watching her. Especially midnight. The black stallion stood atop a low rise, regal and unwavering. He wasn't pacing. Wasn't grazing. He was waiting. She rose slowly, stepping into view. Midnight didn't flinch. He lowered his head once, deliberately, as if acknowledging her presence. Elena felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. Something had shifted. There was an invitation in that gesture, or a challenge. An hour later she returned to town, mind spinning. The connection between Annie and the herd had grown undeniable. Elena could no longer treat it as coincidence. But instinct wasn't enough. She needed answers. Evidence. Something tangible that bridged the impossible with the real. So she went to the one place she hadn't dared revisit. The Whitlock Ranch. It sat on the outskirts of the old cattle trail, hidden behind a stretch of mesquite and ironwood, its fencing collapsed and the house weathered to gray bones. Abandoned yet not entirely dead. The wind carried a strange quiet here, like the land was holding its breath. Inside the house, dust lay thick as velvet over every surface. Elena stepped lightly across buckled floorboards, eyes scanning the remnants of another life. She found photographs first. Faded and curled, but unmistakable, Thomas Whitlock with his daughter. Annie at 3, then 5, then older, always with horses nearby. Her smile fierce. Free. She found journals next. Pages scrawled with meticulous observations. Wild horse migration routes, foaling patterns, behavior under stress. But it was one entry dated 3 years ago that made her freeze. She hears them before I do now. Annie says they speak when they're scared. Not in words but in feeling. I'm starting to believe it. She's got something in her blood I never had, not just patience but presence. The Mustangs trust her more than me now. If anything ever happens to me, they'll find her. I know they will. Elena sat down hard on the edge of a sunken sofa. He knew. Whitlock hadn't just trained horses. He'd raised a girl to be with them, beyond trust, beyond domestication. And he didn't just ride them. She understood them. And they, in turn, had become her guardians. Outside, a low whinny broke the stillness. Elena stepped onto the porch and saw them, 5 Mustangs at the treeline. The silver mare at the front. Not Midnight this time. But her. The matriarch. The one who had led them to Annie in the first place. Elena didn't move. Neither did the mare. They stared at each other across 30 feet of scrub and silence. Then the mare turned, trotted back into the trees and disappeared. The invitation was clear now. They were ready to show her more. That night, she sat with Annie in the hospital room, the journal resting on her lap. I found it, she said quietly. Your father's writing. He talked about you. About how they listened to you. Annie looked up slowly. Her voice was raw with disuse. He said, if I got lost, they'd come. Elena nodded. They did. Annie hesitated. They didn't want to. Not at first. But something scared them. Papa said if the herds ever started moving toward roads, something was wrong. Elena's heart thudded. What kind of wrong? Annie's hands tightened on the blanket. Men. Quieter than rangers. They come in trucks. No plates. They chase the herds. Trap them. Sell them. Elena's blood went cold. Illegal roundups. It wasn't a new fear. Rogue contractors had been known to operate in remote corners of the West, capturing Mustangs for slaughter or black market auctions. Always covert. Always brutal. But if Annie had seen it firsthand, and if the herd had been running from it, it meant the threat was active. Now, she contacted Kyle that evening. I need trail cameras and drone access, she said. Off the books. North quadrant of the preserve. He raised an eyebrow. What are we looking for? Ghost trucks. Unmarked. And maybe worse. Within 48 hours the footage came in. Elena watched it unfold on the station monitor in silence. A convoy of 3 matte black pickups riding without headlights. Men in camo gear. High-powered tranquilizer rifles. One drone caught a shot of a young Mustang collapsing mid-sprint. Another was dragged, unconscious, onto a flatbed. No permits. No ranger tags. Just shadows and violence. Rage burned like wildfire in her chest. The Mustangs had stormed the highway not out of desperation, but out of warning. Out of need. They couldn't speak. So they showed her. And Annie. Annie was the key to understanding it all. She called a meeting with the Bureau the next day. No more secrets. No more waiting. Within a week they launched a task force. And within that same week, Annie was released from the hospital. She didn't want to stay in town. Not with walls. Not with sirens. So Elena brought her somewhere else. To the hills. Where midnight waited. They watched each other from a distance at first. Then the stallion approached, slowly, head low. Annie stepped forward, trembling, not with fear but awe. He touched his muzzle to her shoulder. A gesture of recognition. Of welcome. Elena felt something catch in her throat. Thomas Whitlock was gone. But his legacy stood on 4 legs and spoke with thunder. His daughter. And a stallion reborn. She would train with them. Learn again what she already knew. And together they would protect the herd. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was still hidden. Beneath the brush, beneath the silence, beneath the whispers of the past. A final truth. Waiting to surface, Echo Ridge loomed before them like a silent sentinel, a jagged crown of rock against the wide emptiness of the desert. The sky above had darkened, the storm clouds massing in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of rain and dust, a storm brewing both in the heavens and on the earth below. Elena sat atop her horse, her fingers tight on the reins, her gaze fixed on the ridge. Beside her, Annie was mounted on Midnight, the stallion's black coat a stark contrast to the ochre hills. The wind tugged at their clothes, a bitter reminder of what was to come. But neither of them moved. Not yet. For the past week, they had followed the Mustangs, the herd's movements guiding them like a steady pulse. Elena knew they were being led somewhere important, somewhere that might give them the answers they were searching for. She had never thought she would come back to this place. Back to Echo Ridge where her father's voice had once echoed, where old legends whispered of betrayal and vengeance. But here they were. What do you think they're waiting for? Annie's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of unspoken questions. Elena turned to look at her, her expression unreadable. Annie had come a long way since the day they had found her, wild and untamed as the horses she rode. Her silence, once a barrier, had evolved into something deeper, a kind of knowing that Elena could hardly grasp. They had trained together for days, and though Annie had yet to speak much of her father or the life she had known, Elena sensed that something had shifted within her, a quiet power growing. "They're waiting for us to do the right thing," Elena said, her voice low. She took a deep breath and shifted in the saddle. "We're close. This is where it all changes." Annie nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the ridge. Elena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, an echo of the anticipation that was building inside of her. There was no turning back now. The Mustangs had led them here for a reason, and they had to trust that reason. In the distance, the herd was gathered on the open plain, their forms scattered but unmistakable. Midnight stood tall, his head held high, as if he too was waiting for something to happen. The other Mustangs, smaller and more agile, moved like shadows across the landscape. They were all here, drawn to Echo Ridge as if it were a sacred ground. Elena tightened her grip on the reins, her instincts sharp. The storm was coming, fast. The wind had picked up, whipping the dust into the air, making it harder to see clearly. A storm of fury and reckoning. "We're not alone," Elena said suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. She had felt it before, a shift in the air, the kind of stillness that precedes an attack. "They're coming." Annie looked at her, startled. "Who?" "Elena, we've been tracking them, but they've been tracking us too. The people who've been rounding up the herds, the ones who won't stop until they take them all." As if on cue, the sound of engines reached their ears, low at first, then growing louder. 4 trucks, black, menacing and too close for comfort, emerged from the valley below, their headlights cutting through the dust like knives. Elena could see the men inside, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, their movements calculated and cold. They were coming to take the Mustangs. Elena's stomach churned, and a surge of anger rose within her. She had known this moment was inevitable, but now, as the trucks barreled toward the herd, the reality of it hit with a gut-wrenching force. The men had no respect for the land. No respect for the horses. They saw only dollar signs, and the Mustangs were nothing but a commodity. "We have to stop them," Elena said, her voice firm. She turned to Annie, meeting her eyes. "It's not just about saving the herd anymore. It's about stopping this madness for good." Annie nodded, her face set in determination. "I won't let them take them." With a sharp crack of the reins, Elena spurred her horse forward, racing toward the herd. The Mustangs were scattered now, their instincts kicking in, but Elena could feel their fear. They had no time to waste. She could hear the trucks gaining ground behind her, the growl of the engines loud and threatening. Midnight was already ahead of her, his hooves pounding the earth as if he were part of the wind itself. Annie leaned forward, urging him on, her eyes fixed ahead, her connection with the stallion undeniable. Elena could feel the power of their bond, the way the horse seemed to respond to her every movement, her every thought. But it wasn't just the herd they had to protect. It was something deeper. Something Elena had known from the very beginning. Thomas Whitlock had been right. If anything ever happened to him, the Mustangs would find Annie. They had chosen her. And now, in this moment, the legacy of the Whisperer was being tested. The trucks were closing in, their lights flashing across the plain. Elena could hear the men shouting, their voices drowned by the roar of the engines. But it was the sound of hooves that filled her ears, the thunderous stampede of the herd as they turned to face their pursuers. The first truck swerved, the driver trying to regain control as the Mustangs charged toward them. But it was too late. The horses were too fast, too wild. The stallions led the charge, their hooves striking the earth with the power of thunder. The trucks screeched to a halt, but the Mustangs were relentless. They surrounded the vehicles, blocking their path, their bodies moving as one, a living wall of defiance. Elena reached the ridge and turned her horse, eyes scanning the chaos unfolding below. The men in the trucks were trapped. The herd had them surrounded. They would not escape. But it wasn't enough to stop them. Elena knew they had to make sure it ended here. She turned to Annie, her voice cutting through the storm. "Stay with them. I'm going after the leader." Annie didn't hesitate. Midnight was already moving, weaving through the herd to keep the men at bay. Elena urged her horse forward, her heart racing as she rode toward the leader's truck, the one that seemed to be controlling the others. The driver saw her coming. His eyes narrowed, and he gunned the engine, the truck lurching forward, trying to break free of the herd. But Elena was faster. She rode hard, cutting him off, her horse sliding to a stop just in front of the truck. The man slammed on the brakes, but Elena didn't give him a chance to react. She dismounted in one smooth motion, drawing her gun as she approached the truck. The man inside froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. "Elena Cruz," she said, her voice steady. "You've been illegally rounding up Mustangs. This ends now." The man stared at her for a moment, then reached for his rifle. Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Before he could raise it, Midnight reared up beside her, his hooves striking the air, a roar of fury that sent the man scrambling backward. "Get out," Elena ordered. And the man did without another word, leaving the truck to the Mustangs. As the man fled into the distance, Elena turned to the herd. They were still standing their ground, their bodies forming an impenetrable circle around the trucks. The storm finally broke, the first drop of rain hitting the dry earth, a symbol of the promise that had been kept. This wasn't just a battle one. It was a stand, one that would be remembered. The Whisperer's legacy had survived. And the Mustangs were free.